The silent shadow. Elijah Rivers had learned to live in the background. At Jefferson Middle School, he was the kind of student most teachers glanced over. Not because he was struggling, far from it. His grades were solid, his homework was always on time, and he never caused trouble. But something about him seemed to make certain teachers, especially Miss Abigail Thornton, act as if he wasn't there at all. He had noticed it from the first day of school. Miss Thornton, a woman who had spent nearly 15 years shaping young minds, was known for being strict. She prided herself on running a disciplined classroom, one where order reigned and where respect was earned, not given. She had her favorites, students she called on often, students who she praised openly. And then there were students like Elijah. She never outright disrespected him, never insulted him, never scolded him unfairly. But the silence, the way her gaze skimmed past him when his hand was raised, the way she never seemed to acknowledge his efforts, it was its own kind of message. You got, like teacher invisibility or something. Tyler Whitman, his best friend, had whispered to him once, grinning. Elijah had only shrugged. Guess I do. It wasn't worth making a fuss over. Or so he had thought. That particular Monday morning, something was different. Elijah sat near the window, tapping his pencil against his notebook in an absent-minded rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was a habit, one his mother always told him to break. You fidget when you're thinking, she'd say, shaking her head. Miss Thornton was at the front of the classroom, flipping through her notes, but today she was watching him. Not just the usual occasional glance, not the kind of look that said she was checking attendance. This was something else, something that felt like anticipation. Elijah stiffened slightly, shifting in his seat. She keeps looking at you. Tyler whispered beside him, frowning. Yeah, I noticed. But why? The lesson began as usual, a history discussion about the Civil War. Elijah took notes, listening carefully. He enjoyed history. It was stories, real ones, filled with people who had changed the world in ways no one had expected. People who had been overlooked, underestimated, doubted, until they proved everyone wrong. And then something unexpected happened. Miss Thornton turned from the whiteboard, her eyes sweeping the room. Then she said a name she almost never did. Elijah. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Even Tyler sat up straighter. Why don't you answer this one? She asked, her voice crisp, controlled. Elijah blinked. She never called on him. Not once in the months he'd been in her class. He sat up, scanning the board quickly. His mind worked fast. This was about General Sherman. His march to the sea. A campaign designed to cripple the Confederacy's resources. He knew the answer. Ah. Elijah cleared his throat. General Sherman's march to the sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. Miss Thornton's lips pressed together. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were studying him. Not praise, not encouragement, just hum. A few students exchanged glances. Even they could tell something was off. Tyler shot him a look that said, "What was that about?" Elijah didn't know, but something about the way she was looking at him made his stomach twist. The lesson moved on, but the tension in the air didn't fade. It felt like the beginning of something, and Elijah wasn't sure he liked it. The real surprise came at the end of class. The bell rang, chairs scraped against the floor, and students packed their bags. Elijah zipped up his backpack, ready to leave when Miss Thornton's voice cut through the noise. Elijah, stay behind for a moment. The room stilled for a second. A few students hesitated, curious but cautious, before filing out. Tyler gave Elijah a quick glance before disappearing into the hallway. Elijah took his time putting his notebook away, then approached the desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," Miss Thornton said, clasping her hands together. Elijah frowned. "About what?" "Your grandfather." His body tensed. "What about him?" Her expression was unreadable. "You said he was a musician, a pianist, wasn't he? Elijah hesitated. He had mentioned it in passing once, maybe to Tyler or Brandon. But why did she care? Yeah, he admitted. He played jazz. Miss Thornton's lips curled, not quite a smirk, but something close. Interesting, she murmured, tapping her fingers against the desk. You must have picked up a thing or two. Elijah's gut told him something was off. He didn't know where this was going, but it didn't feel right. A little. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good to know. The bell rang again, the final warning for students to get to their next class. Elijah turned toward the door, relieved. But then, tomorrow. He stopped, glancing back. What? Miss Thornton gestured toward the back of the room, toward the old upright piano collecting dust in the corner. You'll play something for the class. Silence. Elijah stared at her. He wasn't the only one. A few students who had lingered near the doorway turned to look as well. Why? He asked slowly. Miss Thornton tilted her head, as if the question amused her. Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you. Elijah knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. She expected him to fail, to embarrass himself in front of everyone. But she didn't know the full story. That night, Elijah barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over. This wasn't a request. It was a challenge. She expected him to stumble, to prove whatever opinion she had already formed about him. But she didn't know the truth. Elijah Rivers didn't just play the piano. He played like his grandfather. And tomorrow, in front of Miss Thornton, the entire class, and everyone who had ever overlooked him, he was going to show them all. The weight of expectations. Elijah spent the entire evening thinking about the challenge Miss Thornton had set for him. He sat in his bedroom, fingers lightly tapping on his desk as if he were already playing the piano. The thought of performing in front of the class didn't scare him. He had played before, countless times, both alone and with his grandfather. Music was in his blood, something natural and instinctive. But this wasn't about music. This was about proving a point. His mother noticed his distraction as they ate dinner. She set down her fork and studied him with that sharp, knowing gaze she always had. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Elijah hesitated. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow was going to be important. "Miss Thornton wants me to play piano in front of the class," he finally admitted. His mother's expression flickered for a moment. "She asked you to." "More like challenged me to," Elijah corrected. He could see the gears turning in her mind. She knew exactly what he meant. His mother wasn't blind to the way certain people overlooked him, how some teachers expected less from him without even knowing him. He had inherited his quiet nature from her, the ability to observe before acting. "She doesn't think you can do it," his mother said plainly. Elijah sighed. "No, she doesn't." His mother took a slow sip of her iced tea before setting the glass down with a thoughtful nod. "Then you know what you have to do." There was no need to explain further. His mother had always raised him to stand tall, to let his actions speak louder than words. His grandfather had taught him the same thing. Through music, through patience, through hours of practicing until his fingers knew the keys better than his own heartbeat. Elijah didn't practice that night. He didn't need to. The music was already inside him. He just had to let it out. The next morning, the air in the classroom was different. Word had spread quickly. Tyler shot him a look the moment he walked in, a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Dude, people are actually talking about this," he whispered. "Brandon's already making bets on whether you'll choke." Elijah rolled his eyes. "Of course he is." The rest of the class was buzzing with anticipation. Some students glanced his way with mild amusement, expecting a disaster. Others looked curious, genuinely wondering if he had any real skill. And then there was Miss Thornton, standing at the front of the room with the same composed, calculating expression she always wore. The lesson began as usual, but Elijah barely heard any of it. His mind kept skipping ahead to the inevitable moment when she would call on him, when she would direct him to that dusty, neglected piano in the corner. And then, after what felt like an eternity, it happened. Miss Thornton closed her lesson book and glanced at the clock. "Well," she said, a small, almost satisfied smile playing at her lips, "we have a little time before the next lesson." "Perfect." Her gaze shifted to Elijah. "Let's see what you can do." The air in the room shifted. The whispers stopped. Some students leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. Others smirked, ready to watch him fail. Elijah took a deep breath. This was it. He stood slowly, ignoring the snickers, the muttered remarks. As he walked toward the piano, he heard someone whisper, "This is gonna be good." Good? No. This was going to be unforgettable. The piano was old, its wooden frame scratched, and its keys slightly yellowed from age. It had been sitting in the corner of the classroom for as long as Elijah could remember, untouched and forgotten. As he ran his fingers lightly over the keys, he could feel that it was out of tune. Not by much, but enough to make some notes sound uneven. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he felt calm, centered, ready. Then he played. The first notes drifted into the silence, soft and steady, a simple blues progression, the kind his grandfather had played on humid summer afternoons in their living room. His left hand kept the rhythm, steady and controlled, while his right hand danced across the keys, weaving a melody that felt effortless. The reaction was immediate. The room, once filled with whispers and snickers, fell completely silent. The students who had been smirking before now sat up straighter, their eyes widening in surprise. Tyler's jaw literally dropped. Even Brandon, who had been so eager to mock him, stared with his arms crossed, his usual cocky expression replaced with something closer to disbelief. And then there was Miss Thornton. She hadn't moved. Her arms were still crossed, her posture still stiff, but her expression had changed. She had expected hesitation, maybe a few wrong notes, something to confirm whatever assumptions she had made about Elijah. Instead, she was hearing something she hadn't prepared for. Elijah didn't play like a beginner. He played like someone who had spent years mastering the instrument, someone who understood the depth and emotion behind every note. His fingers glided effortlessly, shifting into something more complex, something richer. He didn't just play, he commanded the piano. And then he took a risk. He shifted into a more intricate progression, letting his hands move faster, his right hand weaving in delicate, complex runs, while his left hand maintained a deep, pulsing bass line. It was a piece his grandfather had taught him, one that had taken him months to master. The kind of piece that separated true musicians from amateurs. The longer he played, the heavier the silence became. The smirks were gone. The skepticism was gone. Now, there was only awe. And then, the final crescendo. Elijah struck the last chord, letting it ring out, filling the room with one last burst of energy before finally letting the sound fade. He lifted his hands from the keys and let them rest on his lap. For a moment, there was nothing. Then someone clapped, and then another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Tyler let out a low whistle. "Dan," he muttered under his breath. Brandon, still sitting with his arms crossed, shook his head slightly. "I didn't know he could do that." Elijah exhaled, his heartbeat steady. He hadn't played to impress them. He hadn't played to prove them wrong. He had played because he knew who he was. But the loudest silence in the room came from Miss Thornton. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. And Elijah knew exactly why. Because she had never expected this. Because she had underestimated him. And now, there was no going back. A silence that speaks volumes. The applause still echoed in the classroom, loud and unexpected. It wasn't polite clapping, the kind students gave after an obligatory presentation. It was real, genuine, the kind that carried an unspoken shift in the air. Elijah sat there, fingers still resting on his lap, watching the room react to what had just happened. Tyler was grinning in shock, shaking his head like he had just witnessed a magic trick. Madison, one of the smartest students in class, looked completely caught off guard, her mouth slightly open. Even Brandon, the one who always found a way to make jokes, sat with his arms crossed, but his usual smirk replaced by something closer to respect. But the one reaction Elijah cared about the most was Miss Thornton's. She hadn't clapped, hadn't said a word, hadn't moved. For the first time since he had known her, she looked uncertain. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or gloat in triumph. He just sat still, waiting, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Miss Thornton cleared her throat. It was subtle, a small noise, but in the silence, it sounded loud. She straightened her posture and forced an unreadable expression onto her face. "Well," she said, her voice clipped, professional. "That was unexpected. That was it. No praise, no acknowledgement of what had just happened, just those 3 words." The applause faded awkwardly, students exchanging confused glances. Even they knew she was downplaying it. Brandon scoffed from his seat. "That's all you're gonna say?" Miss Thornton's gaze snapped to him. "Excuse me." Brandon gestured vaguely toward the piano. "I mean, come on. He just played like a professional, or something. And you're just moving on." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the classroom. Even Madison, who rarely ever involved herself in class drama, tilted her head slightly, watching Miss Thornton carefully. Elijah didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The class was speaking for him. Miss Thornton's jaw tightened for a brief moment before she composed herself. She exhaled slowly, pressing her hands onto her desk. "This is a classroom," she said firmly, "not a talent show. We still have a lesson to finish." Just like that, she tried to erase what had happened, tried to push it aside, bury it, pretend that for a moment she hadn't been wrong. But something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Elijah met her gaze evenly. She held it for a moment longer before looking away, turning back to the whiteboard, as if she could regain control of the room by ignoring the moment. The lesson resumed, but the energy in the classroom was different now. For the first time all year, Miss Thornton wasn't the one controlling it. At lunch, Elijah was the center of attention. He wasn't used to it. Usually, he and Tyler sat in their usual spot, talking about music or science fiction, ignoring the louder tables where students gossiped about the latest drama. But today, people were coming to him. Madison sat across from him, pushing her tray aside as she leaned in. "How long have you been playing like that?" Elijah swallowed a bite of his sandwich before answering. "Since I was 5. Brandon, who had joined the table uninvited, let out a short laugh. "Dude, you've been holding out on us." Elijah shrugged. "Guess so." Tyler nudged his shoulder. "Nah, man. That wasn't just playing. That was something else." He shook his head. "I mean, I knew you liked music, but I didn't know you cold." He gestured in the air, struggling to find the right words. "Be better than the actual music teacher," Brandon offered, grinning. Madison smirked, but her expression sobered as she glanced toward the other side of the cafeteria. "Miss Thornton's been avoiding looking at anyone. It's like she's pretending this morning didn't happen." Elijah followed her gaze. Sure enough, Miss Thornton was sitting alone at a corner table, eating her salad in complete silence. Usually, she would acknowledge students as they passed, occasionally chatting with the teachers who shared the lunchroom. But today, she looked tense. She knew what had happened in that classroom. And she knew she had lost control of the narrative. Elijah took another bite of his sandwich and focused on his food. He had already said everything he needed to say. He hadn't needed words. The music had spoken for him. That evening, when Elijah walked home, the world felt lighter. For so long, he had carried the weight of being overlooked, of being the quiet kid who was there but never truly seen. He had accepted it as part of life, a fact as certain as the sky being blue. But today had changed things. As he walked into his house, his mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The smell of fried catfish filled the air, warm and familiar. She looked up when he entered and gave him a knowing smile. "You're home late." Elijah set his bag down and took a seat at the table. "Had a long day." His mother raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" Elijah thought about it. Thought about the silence in the classroom when he played. Thought about the way Miss Thornton had finally looked at him, really looked at him, and realized she had misjudged him. He smiled. "Good. Really good." His mother set a plate of cornbread in front of him and sat across from him. "Wanna tell me about it?" And so he did. For the next 15 minutes, Elijah told her everything. About Miss Thornton's challenge, about the class's reaction, about the way things had shifted. She listened carefully, never interrupting, just letting him get it all out. When he was finished, she exhaled, her expression thoughtful. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." "I think I did." His mother tilted her head. "And how do you feel about that?" Elijah thought about it, about the way the entire room had changed, the way Miss Thornton had been forced to see him differently. Like he had shattered whatever assumptions she had built in her mind about him. Like she would never be able to ignore him again. "I feel like it was supposed to happen," he finally said. His mother smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Good." And just like that, he knew he had won. Not just against Miss Thornton. Not just against the students who had expected him to fail. But against every doubt, every underestimation, every quiet dismissal he had ever endured. Because now, they all knew. Elijah Rivers wasn't invisible anymore, the echo of a note that won't fade. The next morning, Elijah walked into Jefferson Middle School feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind that came from showing off, but the kind that came from knowing he had done something that mattered. The kind of pride that settled in the chest, quiet and steady, like the hum of a well-tuned instrument. For the first time in a long while, people noticed him. As he moved through the hallways, students glanced his way, some offering nods of acknowledgement, others whispering to their friends as he passed. It was a strange feeling, being seen. Not just as another face in the crowd, but as someone who had made an impact. Tyler caught up to him near his locker, grinning. "Dude, people are still talking about yesterday." Elijah smirked. "Yeah, I figured." "Nah, man, I mean it. It's different now. You're like, I don't know, famous or something." Tyler leaned against the lockers. "Even the 8th graders were talking about you and Jim." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" "Seriously," Tyler said. "Madison told me she heard some kids say you should audition for those music programs in high school." He shook his head, laughing. "Wild, right? Like 2 days ago, people barely knew you existed, and now they're acting like you're some kind of legend." Elijah chuckled, but he felt the weight of what Tyler was saying. Something had shifted. But it wasn't just the students who had changed the way they looked at him. As he walked into Miss Thornton's classroom, the atmosphere was different. The usual pre-class chatter was still there, but there was something beneath it, a lingering awareness. People were watching him, not with amusement, but with curiosity. With something close to respect. Miss Thornton was already at her desk, flipping through a lesson book. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Elijah saw something there, something that hadn't been there before. A hesitation. She was still Miss Thornton, still strict, still composed. But Elijah could tell that yesterday's performance had shaken something in her. She didn't look at him the same way anymore. And that meant everything. The lesson began as usual, but something was off. Miss Thornton wasn't her normal self. She still ran the class with the same structured efficiency, but her usual sharpness was missing. Normally, she called on students with precision, challenging them, pushing them to be better. But today, she was distracted. Her tone was measured, almost cautious. It wasn't obvious to most students, But Elijah noticed. It was in the way she avoided his gaze when she scanned the room. The way she didn't press him for answers the way she once would have. The way she seemed to be thinking about something, even as she lectured. And Elijah knew exactly why. Yesterday had shattered something for her. She had expected to embarrass him, to prove whatever silent assumptions she had held about him. But instead, he had forced her to see him differently. And now she was struggling with that reality. The class moved on, but the tension never quite faded. And when the bell rang, Elijah packed his things slowly, waiting. Sure enough, just as he was about to leave, Miss Thornton's voice stopped him. "Elijah." He turned. Miss Thornton stood behind her desk, her hands folded neatly on the surface. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her posture, something more careful than before. "Stay for a moment." The last few students glanced back curiously, but when Miss Thornton gave them her usual no-nonsense look, they hurried out. Elijah stayed by his desk, his bag slung over his shoulder, waiting. For a long moment, Miss Thornton didn't say anything. She just looked at him, not in the dismissive way she had before. Not like she was trying to make him disappear, but like she was trying to figure something out. Finally, she spoke. "You surprised me yesterday." Elijah didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The silence that stretched between them said everything. Miss Thornton exhaled slowly, tapping a pen against her desk. "I didn't expect that from you." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" Miss Thornton hesitated, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked uncertain. Not nervous, not afraid, but like she had stepped onto unfamiliar ground and didn't quite know how to navigate it. Finally, she answered, "Because I misjudged you." The admission was soft, barely there, but it was real. Elijah studied her for a long moment. He could have let her off the hook, could have accepted the small acknowledgement and moved on. But he didn't. "You didn't think I could do it," he said, keeping his voice even. Miss Thornton's jaw tightened slightly, but she nodded. "No, I didn't." The words hung between them. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind authority. She wasn't pretending she hadn't dismissed him. She was admitting it. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Miss Thornton cleared her throat and straightened her posture. "You have talent," she said, her voice regaining some of its usual crispness. "And I hope you don't waste it." Elijah nodded. "I don't plan to." She watched him for a moment longer, then sighed. "You can go." Elijah turned and walked toward the door, but just as he reached it, he paused. Then, without looking back, he said, "You know, you could have just asked." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt it. The way the air seemed lighter. The way the weight he had carried for so long had finally started to lift. Miss Thornton would probably never apologize, would probably never say outright that she had underestimated him because of who she thought he was. But now, she knew the truth. And that was enough. Because Elijah Rivers had proven something, not just to her, but to everyone. Some people talk. Some people assume. Some people judge. But the best way to silence all of that. Let your talent speak louder than their doubts. And Elijah, he had been heard. A change in the melody. The next few days at Jefferson Middle School were different, and Elijah felt it in ways both subtle and obvious. It wasn't just that students noticed him more. It was the way they looked at him now. Not as the quiet kid who sat near the window, minding his own business, but as someone who had done something they hadn't expected. Someone who had forced people to see him. The energy in Miss Thornton's classroom had changed too. Not drastically, but enough for Elijah to recognize that things were no longer the same. Before, she never called on him, never acknowledged him unless she had no choice. But now she called on him, not frequently, but enough for it to be clear that she was making an effort. She still had her usual sharpness, her no-nonsense approach, but something about her felt less rigid than before, Like the iron grip she had over the classroom had loosened just a little. Elijah didn't know if she liked that shift, but it was happening anyway. And then, on Friday afternoon, something happened that made it clear that nothing would ever be the same. It started in music class. Most of the time, music class at Jefferson Middle was just another period students sat through, either because they had to or because it was an easy grade. The teacher, Mr. Callahan, was one of the few teachers Elijah actually liked, a man with a worn-out guitar and a genuine passion for music. But even he had no idea what was coming. It started when Mr. Callahan introduced a new class project, a group assignment where students would compose and perform a short piece of music together. It wasn't anything major, just a way to get students involved in something creative. "All right," Mr. Callahan said, clapping his hands together. "Pick your groups, 3 or 4 people each. And remember, this isn't just about playing. It's about creating something." Elijah had barely turned to Tyler when he felt it. Eyes on him. People were watching him, waiting. The same students who had barely acknowledged him before were now hoping to be in his group. "Yo, Elijah," Brandon called from across the room. "You want to work together?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. Brandon, the same kid who had mocked him before, was now asking to team up. Tyler smirked. "Dude, I bet half the class is hoping you'll say yes." And he was right. Even Madison, who had never been interested in music before, seemed interested in working with him. It was strange. Before, nobody had thought twice about him. Now, it was like he had power. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that mattered. People saw him differently now. And that meant something. Elijah ended up working with Tyler, Madison, and a girl named Sienna. Sienna played violin, which immediately changed how they approached their project. Elijah knew he could do something interesting with that. They sat in a circle in the music room, instruments in hand. "All right," Madison said, tapping her pencil against her notebook. "So, how do we start?" Elijah considered it for a moment. Then, without saying anything, he placed his hands on the piano keys and started playing. Not loud, not flashy, just a soft, simple melody, a foundation for something bigger. Sienna listened carefully, then nodded. She lifted her violin, played a few hesitant notes over the piano chords. Then, with more confidence, she started matching the rhythm. Tyler, sitting next to Elijah, started tapping a beat on the desk. Madison, surprisingly, hummed a quiet harmony. And just like that, something clicked. Music wasn't just about sound. It was about connection, about listening, about taking something small and turning it into something bigger. Elijah had always known that, but now his classmates were starting to understand it too. When the final bell rang, ending the school day, Elijah felt something different inside him. For years, school had felt like something he just had to get through, something that moved around him while he stayed in the background. But today, it felt like he was part of something. Not just a silent shadow, not just a kid who went unnoticed, but someone people listened to. As he walked through the hallways, bag slung over his shoulder, he heard footsteps behind him. Elijah. He knew the voice before he turned. Miss Thornton. She stood there in the near-empty hallway, arms crossed, but not as tightly as before. There was still steel in her posture, but something in her face was different. Less guarded. More human. "I heard about your music project," she said. Elijah nodded. "Yeah." She studied him for a long moment. "I hear your group is doing well." Elijah shrugged. "We're figuring it out." Miss Thornton was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed. "I wasn't fair to you," she said finally. Elijah stilled. It wasn't a full apology, but it was as close as she would ever get. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time, not as a student she had once ignored, but as someone she now had to respect. "You're talented, Elijah," she said, "more than I gave you credit for." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know." Miss Thornton almost smiled at that. almost. Then, with a small nod, she turned and walked away. And Elijah? Elijah walked out of the school doors feeling lighter than he ever had before. Because today, he hadn't just played music. He had changed the way people saw him. And that mattered more than anything. When the music speaks for you, by Monday, the entire school knew about Elijah Rivers. It wasn't just a passing rumor anymore. It wasn't just a moment people talked about and then forgot. It was something bigger. People who had never spoken to him before were suddenly interested in his music. Teachers who had barely acknowledged him were paying attention. Even students from other grades were whispering his name in the hallways. Elijah wasn't used to this. For most of his life, he had been invisible. Now he was something else. And while part of him liked the recognition, there was a small part of him that was waiting. Waiting for someone to remind him that it wasn't supposed to be like this. Waiting for someone to challenge his right to be seen. And sure enough, that moment came. But not in the way he expected. The day started like any other. Elijah walked into his history class and took his usual seat near the window. Tyler nodded at him, grinning. "Yo, you hear about Friday?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "Miss Thornton." Tyler smirked. "She's been weird since." He mimed playing a piano. "Like extra strict with everyone, but not with you." Elijah shrugged. "Maybe she's still trying to figure me out." Tyler chuckled. "Or maybe she's just mad she was wrong." Elijah didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew Tyler was right. Miss Thornton wasn't used to being wrong. And the fact that she had misjudged him wasn't something she could easily shake off. But she was trying. And that mattered. By lunchtime, Elijah was used to the stares. What he wasn't expecting was for Mr. Callahan, the music teacher, to find him. Elijah had just finished eating when Mr. Callahan approached his table, holding a clipboard. "Hey, Elijah, got a second?" Elijah nodded. "Yeah, what's up?" Mr. Callahan smiled. "I've got a proposition for you." Elijah blinked. "A what?" Mr. Callahan set the clipboard down. "The school's winter concert is coming up in a few weeks. It's usually just the band and choir, but..." He tilted his head. "I was thinking, maybe we could have a solo pianist this year." The words hit Elijah like a chord struck too hard. "Wait, you want me to play?" Mr. Callahan nodded. "I saw the way people reacted when you played last week. You've got something special, Elijah. And I think people should hear it." Elijah sat back, the weight of the offer settling over him. A solo performance, not just playing in class, not just a project, a performance for the entire school. Tyler let out a low whistle. "Dude, that's huge." Mr. Callahan smiled. "Think about it, all right. Let me know by Friday." He patted Elijah's shoulder before walking off, leaving the clipboard behind. Elijah stared at it. Tyler nudged him. "You're gonna do it, right?" Elijah exhaled slowly. "I don't know, man." Tyler frowned. "Why not? You literally blew everyone's mind last time." Elijah ran a hand over his face. "That was different. That was just our class." He gestured around the cafeteria. This is everyone." Tyler studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "Nah, bro, this isn't about the audience. This is about you." Elijah didn't answer. But deep down, he knew Tyler was right. That night, Elijah sat at his piano at home, staring at the keys. He had been playing since he was 5. His grandfather had taught him everything he knew. But something about this felt different. Bigger. More important. He placed his fingers on the keys and let them move instinctively, the familiar melodies flowing from muscle memory. The house was quiet except for the sound of the piano filling the space. And as he played, he remembered something his grandfather had told him years ago. Music isn't about showing off, Elijah. It's about telling a story, about making people feel something. He had felt that in the classroom last week. He had felt that when Miss Thornton's expression had changed. He had felt that when the silence had turned to applause. And maybe it was time to do it again. By Friday, Elijah had made his decision. He walked into the music room before class and found Mr. Callahan at his desk. The teacher looked up, expectant. "So," Elijah took a deep breath. "I'll do it." Mr. Callahan grinned. "Good choice." Elijah nodded, because this wasn't just about a concert anymore. This was about proving, to himself, to Miss Thornton, to everyone, that he had always belonged in the spotlight, even if it had taken them too long to see it. The performance that changed everything. The days leading up to the winter concert felt different. Elijah could feel the weight of it, of knowing that soon he wouldn't just be playing for a classroom of skeptical students or a teacher who had underestimated him. He would be playing for the entire school. And that pressure, it was real. Mr. Callahan had given him full creative freedom to choose what he wanted to perform. He could play anything, classical, jazz, blues, but Elijah knew from the moment he agreed that he wasn't going to play something safe. He was going to play something personal, something that would speak louder than words, something that would make everyone listen. And so, he spent every night at the piano, running through compositions, testing different melodies, refining what felt right. His mother never told him to go to bed early or take a break. She just listened from the kitchen, nodding in quiet approval. Because she knew, just like Elijah did, that this performance wasn't just music. It was a statement. The night of the concert, the auditorium was packed. Rows of students, parents, and teachers filled the seats, all waiting for the performances to begin. The school's band played first, followed by the choir, and then a few small ensemble pieces. Elijah waited backstage, his hands in his pockets, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath his ribs. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Finally, Mr. Callahan stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. "Our final solo performance tonight is by someone who has recently proven to be one of the most talented pianists this school has ever seen. Please welcome Elijah Rivers." A murmur spread through the audience as Elijah walked onto the stage. He could hear whispers. "That's the kid who played in class that day. Is he really that good? Miss Thornton's class is still talking about it." He ignored it all. He sat at the piano, hands poised over the keys, eyes closed for just a second. And then he played. The first notes were soft, delicate, like a memory unfolding. The melody was warm, rich with emotion, telling a story before a single word had been spoken. It wasn't a song people recognized. It was something new, something that came from him. The notes swelled, built, rising and falling like waves. His left hand held down the deep, steady rhythm, while his right hand danced across the keys, carrying the melody higher, bolder. And then he took a risk, a shift in tempo, a transition into something deeper, more intricate, a piece his grandfather had once played, one that had always stayed with him. The chords echoed in the auditorium, filling the space with a sound so powerful it felt like it belonged in a concert hall, not a middle school. The energy in the room changed. The whispers stopped. The noise of people shifting in their seats disappeared. And when Elijah finally reached the crescendo, his fingers moving faster, stronger, hitting every note with precision and passion, the entire room felt like it was holding its breath. The final chord rang out, fading into silence. And for a moment, nobody moved. Then, the auditorium erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, cheering. Tyler was on his feet, whooping loudly. Brandon, who had once laughed at him, was nodding in quiet respect. Even Madison had a rare smile on her face, clapping along with the others. And then, amidst the standing ovation, Elijah's eyes found Miss Thornton. She was in the crowd, arms crossed, face unreadable. But she wasn't looking past him anymore. She wasn't ignoring him. She was listening. And that meant more than any applause. The aftermath. The concert ended, but the impact of Elijah's performance didn't fade. For days, people talked about it. Teachers stopped him in the hallways, asking about his music. Students who had never spoken to him before asked if he'd been playing all his life. Even 8th graders, students who usually ignored 6th graders, nodded at him in respect. But the real moment came on Monday morning. Elijah walked into class, taking his usual seat. Miss Thornton was already at her desk, reviewing her notes. When the bell rang, she didn't start the lesson immediately. Instead, she looked at Elijah. And then, in a voice softer than he had ever heard from her, she said, "That was remarkable, Elijah. It was quiet. It was simple. But it was real." Elijah nodded. "Thank you." She studied him for a moment longer, then smiled, just barely. "Let's begin." And just like that, the final note of his story had been played. Not with words, not with a confrontation, but with music. And now, the world would never ignore Elijah Rivers again.